Guess who's back? Back again. Mason's back. Tell a friend. Hello everyone, we're back with part 2 of reimagining the Batman universe for a comic I'm planning to make on AO3. If you haven't already seen the last video, I've already reimagined the Bat family, so do go check that out if you haven't already, but in today's video we will finally be getting into the extensive rogues gallery, which I am incredibly excited about. I absolutely love writing and designing villains, and the Batman franchise has some of my favourites, so I have been frothing at the mouth to get this video done. Throughout this series, I am planning on redesigning 15 different villains, 5 of which I will be covering in this video, so without any further ado, let's begin. First up we have the Riddler. Now, the Riddler isn't really a character I wanted to change that much, I more so wanted to play up some of his traits that I liked a lot. The Riddler has many different interpretations, but the most common basis for the Riddler's character is an ingenious maniac that could easily get away with the crimes he commits, but his ego is so big that he can't help taking credit for his schemes. This is a great basis for the character, so I very much wanted to not only keep it, but expand upon it. The Riddler's backstory is one of the aspects of the character that seem to change with each interpretation, but a very common theme throughout them all is a fixation on knowledge. I am aware that the Riddler from the Batman 2022 isn't fixated on knowledge at all, instead being more focused on dismantling the corrupt system in Gotham City, and while I do really like this version of the character, I felt that that motivation fit a different character we'll be getting into soon much better, so I mostly stuck to his fixation on knowledge for my version. My version of the character grew up with his single father who was often verbally abusive towards him. He would constantly berate his son every chance he got, the most common of his insults targeted towards his intelligence. When his father died, he was taken into an orphanage where he became fixated on gaining as much knowledge as possible. Due to this fixation, he would often be outcasted by the other children as he constantly felt the need to prove how much smarter he was than everyone else around him. The rest of his origin is very much inspired by the Gotham series as he gets a job as a forensics officer, but I won't go too much into it to avoid spoilers. My version of the Riddler, at his core, is a man that is in constant need of validation, whether that be in the form of outsmarting someone or choosing the pettiest ways to carry out revenge. He constantly feels the need to prove his intelligence as it's the only thing he has. I'm aware that in most versions of the Batman universe, every villain acts as a different kind of narrative foil for Batman, but due to there being so many members of the Bat family, I felt like it might work a little bit better to flesh out the various members if some of the villains acted as parallels or foils to different characters outside of Batman. I mean, honestly, Bruce can share a few narrative parallels, the greedy bastard. Anyway, I think it would be pretty neat if the Riddler acted as a narrative parallel for Oracle at some point in the story. I originally drew the connection due to them both being intelligent characters tied to the colour green, but I think giving Barbara a little bit of an ego similar to the Riddler would add quite a bit of depth to her character and would act as a flaw to overcome over the course of the story. For his design, I didn't do anything wildly different with his outfit. I kept the green and purple colour scheme and the classic bowl hat and cane. I also wanted to keep his dapper sense of style, but make it just a tad bit more flamboyant, so I gave him some stripy bell bottoms and platforms. I also gave him a question mark mask made out of gold to give a couple more nods to his ego through his design. I put him in a green waistcoat and a black shirt with a question mark pattern on it. I imagine that sometimes he wears a big green coat to match the waistcoat, but I didn't want to ruin his silhouette, so I drew a little chibi version of him at the bottom of the drawing wearing another outfit. I can imagine the Riddler as one of the villains that has a different costume for every scheme, but I didn't have the time or space to design more than 2, so that's all I drew, at least for now. I also drew a few different expressions for the character, along with the full body and the close-up drawing. Here is the finished character sheet for Edward Nashton / the Riddler.
Truth is, my living situation has been compromised. Maybe. So I just need a place to crash. Temporarily. But I can't go back empty-handed. Not again. That's just life, Rat. Everyone has a use. And if you don't, bye-bye. Your friend gets it.
Next up we have Poison Ivy. Now, Poison Ivy is a character that I knew from the beginning I wanted to change drastically. Poison Ivy is a character that, despite having a few interpretations over the years that make her more of an actual character, she was always overall often reduced to a victim of the male gaze. I know this may sound patronizing coming from, you know, a guy, but I felt as though any impact the actual character traits or intriguing concepts Poison Ivy has are constantly overshadowed by her sex appeal, leaving her to never really reach the full potential her character could have, because no one writing her wants to go any further than that out of fear of losing her sex appeal. There have been some attempts over the years to make her less sexualized and more of her own character, a good example of this being in the Harley Quinn show, but even these versions of her aren't really going any further with the concepts and motifs of the character, and are playing it fairly safe. And frankly, both the horror writer and proud feminist in me was not having that. I'm 6'4", by the way. I decided to start by taking her base character traits and thinking about how I personally would portray them. I began to think about how, in some way, Poison Ivy is supposed to represent the environment's reaction to climate change, or at least a creature who is severely affected by it due to having a deep connection with plant life. But, at least in my eyes, if you were to create a character that is the embodiment of the current state of the environment, it probably wouldn't be a graceful femme fatale forest nymph that goes around kissing people to get them to do her bidding. It would be an angry, vengeful creature of the earth that's behaviour is violent and erratic due to being in constant overwhelm and pain. Screw your waifu, you fucking gooner, I've turned her into a plant zombie. Essentially, Pamela Isley was a botanist working for the Gotham Department of Science, and, more specifically, Dr. Hugo Strange's metahuman experimentation facility. Yes, the same one that Duke Thomas was confined to. She was given the task to create a new bioweapon using a recently discovered plant that had been found sprouting from the body of a recently deceased metahuman experiment and had been proven to have strange effects on the mind of whoever came in contact with it. Pamela, before beginning her studies on the plant, had never shown any interest in the environment. However, over the course of her experiments on the plant, she would become paranoid, jumpy, and incredibly obsessive over the plant, snapping at any of her co-workers who even dared to show an interest in it. She would slowly lose all agency, and eventually, she would touch the plant without any protective gear, despite all of the lab safety protocols. The plant would quickly latch onto her, invading her body and mind, and essentially killing her. She was deemed legally dead for several months, but due to the plant containing metahuman DNA that would quickly mix with her bloodstream, she would come back from the dead, now no longer human, and in constant, agonizing pain. She would now be a mutated mix of human and plant life, the overwhelming pain of the plant life proving too much for her mind and making her go insane. With a newfound hatred for the human race, she set out on her journey to eradicate them, her first course of action being to cause an outbreak in the metahuman experimentation facility. She gained the ability to control plant life and breathing mind-controlling spores at will, very much inspired by that ant fungus thing. I very much wanted to have a lot more body horror elements to her story and character, as the subject of our dying environment is much more horrifying than we often portray it. Design-wise, I took a bit of inspiration from Jane Prentice from TMA. I gave her long, matted hair messily tied into braids, and for her main outfit, I had her still be in her old lab uniform, now tattered and stained with dirt. I wanted to portray the plant life invading her body by having vines crawling up her face, sprouting from her eyes and mouth, and just generally making her state look incredibly uncomfortable and painful. I had a drawing of what she looked like before her transformation in the top middle of the drawing, where I portrayed her as Romanian, as that's how I pictured her in my head. However, I have had the realization that portraying a Romanian character as an eco-terrorist might be problematic, so I would definitely like to hear some feedback on that from any Romanian person that may be watching. If it is problematic, I do genuinely apologise and I will fix it, as the last thing I want to do when portraying different nationalities is leaning into harmful stereotypes, but I'm unsure as to whether it is or not. Please do let me know, and if it is, I will make sure to do better in the future. My intention when designing characters is always to be more inclusive, never to be harmful, so feedback on this kind of thing is always appreciated. I made her costume relatively simple compared to some of the other designs, as I wanted to draw more attention to her face and hair, but I still tried to make it look reasonably interesting in both the full body drawing and the little chibi version. Here is the finished character sheet for Pamela Isley / Poison Ivy.
This was never about Sallow. You're using me to get to her, and then what? You take what you need, hang me out to dry? I'm expendable? It's made with shimmer. leaves traces on the body. That should be all you need to shut Sallow down. Dangerous as she is, your mother was spooked. Could smell it. Like a cat backed into a corner.
Ah, Harley Quinn, probably the most well-known character in this video. Now, Harley Quinn, despite just how many adaptations she's had, often falls into 3 different character archetypes that I like to call the Harley scale. Firstly, with her earliest depiction, we have the goofy henchwoman, seen in the Batman animated series and the Arkham games, at least the first one. I haven't seen much of the others. This Harley is often loyal to the Joker, doesn't play that big of a role in the story, and is very silly. This version of Harley is often played for comedy, and while this is a version of her that I hold dear to my heart, it doesn't exactly have much depth. Sometimes she has more to her character, or is a bit more serious, like in the Arkham games, but the reason I'd still put that version of her into this category is mostly due to the fact that she's still the Joker's henchwoman and is still incredibly loyal to him. Secondly, we have what I like to call the girl-powered Deadpool clone, seen in the Suicide Squad / Birds of Prey, the Harley Quinn show, and the Harley Quinn comic series. This version of Harley Quinn is often set after her relationship with the Joker has ended, and is the most common version of the Harley Quinn character in modern times. While I do believe that this version of her can be done well, like in the Harley Quinn show, and it is very important to portray strong female characters, I feel that this version is just very overdone. And finally, we have the unfortunate abuse victim, most explicitly shown in the Suicide Squad comic series Volume 14. This version of Harley Quinn is complicated, to say the least. On the one hand, it's very important to rightfully portray an abusive relationship in a way that doesn't downplay the severity of these kinds of situations, as not many pieces of comic media are willing to portray such a dark and serious subject with actual depth and respect. However, what I have also found is that whenever a writer portrays Harley and Joker's relationship as abusive, Harley's character is often cast aside in favour of making her a punching bag to make the Joker look more evil. I don't believe that this subject is always portrayed badly, but the reason I probably wouldn't attempt to portray it myself is because I haven't had enough personal experience with domestic abuse to be able to portray it properly, and while I would try my best, I feel as though I would inevitably get something wrong. Essentially, I just don't feel experienced enough with the subject to attempt to try and portray it. But what would I do with the character? Well, out of all of the versions of Harley Quinn I've seen, and I've seen quite a few, there is only one version of the character that doesn't fit into any of these 3 character archetypes I've just discussed, and that is the version from Batman Caped Crusader. Now, while the show itself is mid, I found what they did with the character of Harley Quinn infinitely fascinating. The most noticeable difference is that she is completely separate from the Joker, which I actually quite like the idea of, as having her backstory revolve around one of the biggest villains in the franchise makes it quite difficult to establish a motivation outside of him. 2 other things I decided to keep from this version of the character is her motivation and her skill set. In the Caped Crusader, they leaned much more into her profession as a psychologist, which I decided to lean into as well. While my version of Harley Quinn is still occasionally bubbly and silly, unlike the Caped Crusader version, she is much more manipulative and calculated, often using her extensive knowledge on psychology to her advantage. I want her to be genuinely interested in the psychology of her victims, constantly trying to analyze them and get in their head. While her demeanor is surprisingly friendly a lot of the time, I wanted a sort of air of fakeness to revolve around her, making it all seem like an act. I also wanted to give her a similar motivation to the Caped Crusader version. Due to all of her incredibly rich clients, she begins to hear about all of the terrible things they've done and begins to want to do something about it. However, she quickly realizes that this corruption runs deeper than she thought, meaning she wouldn't be able to simply speak up or she'd lose all her clients and possibly get sued. So, after having enough, she would take on the role of Harley Quinn, beginning to murder her corrupted clients and leaving clues to their various crimes in order to expose them. When it comes to narrative parallels, I kind of wanted her to act as a mirror to Red Hood. My reasoning for this is due to their similar themes of realizing something that they once put their trust in is much more flawed than they thought, Harley's being the corrupt system of Gotham City, and Jason's being Batman. I thought it might be interesting to have them team up at some point during Red Hood's villain arc as well, as I can imagine Harley would be fascinated by Red Hood's psyche, and Red Hood would be willing to work with anyone that has similar views to him. With her design, I wanted to pay homage to her original design in Batman the Animated Series, as it probably remains one of my favourite of her looks. I kept the iconic red, white and black colour palette, just adding a few more details here and there. I also wanted to lean a bit more into the whole medieval/masquerade aspect of her theme, as it sets her apart a bit more from the Joker, whose theme is more reminiscent of a carnival clown. I also gave her shorter hair than usual, as I just quite like the look of it on her. Here is the finished design for Harley Quinn/Harley Quinn, and by the way, I changed the name because, she was called Harleen Quinzel before. It's so obvious that someone called Harleen Quinzel would be hot. It doesn't matter, I don't need to explain myself to you.
I like your ears. Really? I used to cover them up, but, you know, I am.
Now we move on to a less well-known character with Firefly. Firefly is one of the Batman villains that, due to not being as well known, never really had a set backstory, the only one I can really think of being the version from the Gotham series. However, in a rare case, I've decided not to take inspiration from Gotham with Firefly, instead creating an entirely new story in order to give him a deeper connection with a certain acrobatic vigilante. In the last video, you may recall that I said something about Dick Grayson having a childhood friend who was responsible for his parents' death, and most of you correctly predicted that it was indeed Garfield Linz, so props to everyone that got it right. In my version of the story, Dick and Garfield both grew up in the same circus. While Dick was a member of the Flying Graysons with his parents, Garfield lived with his uncle, the Fire Eater, and was a Fire Eater in training. Dick and Garfield were incredibly close, being the only two in the circus that were the same age. However, one day during a performance, Garfield accidentally started a fire while attempting to practice. The fire would spread throughout the entire circus, killing Garfield's uncle, Dick's parents, and several audience members. Both Dick and Garfield were put in the same orphanage, and even though Dick insisted he didn't blame Garfield for the incident, he knew it was a lie. This point was proven in his mind when Dick jumped at the chance to be adopted by Bruce, leaving Garfield alone in the orphanage. Due to there being a lot of discourse over whether Garfield had intentionally burned down the circus, many of the teachers and other children believed him to be a disturbed, troublemaking child, treating him as such. After years of this behaviour, he would learn to lean into this persona, often causing trouble in a bid to control others' perception of him. However, when one of his schemes would go too far, he would end up once again starting a fire that would quickly burn down the orphanage. Managing to escape the carnage with a few burn scars, the authorities found enough evidence to charge him for arson, leaving Garfield to spend the rest of his youth in Arkham Asylum. When he would finally escape, he worked his way up the ranks and became one of the most infamous arsonists for hire in Gotham. I wanted the main theme of Firefly's story to be control. Despite everyone's perception of Garfield, including his own, as a calculated maniacal mastermind, most of what happened to him in his past was entirely out of his control or an accident, which he hates the idea of. So, in his mind, if he can control something like fire, the very cause of all that has happened to him in his life, what can't he control? I want him to be both a narrative parallel and foil to Nightwing. Both characters have an obsession with controlling others' perception of them, but in opposite ways. Nightwing wants people to see him as cheerful, hopeful, and put together, someone that never has any negative opinions or ever acts irrationally. He wants to be a symbol of hope. On the other hand, Garfield wants to be a symbol of fear. He wants to intimidate people, be seen as powerful, and most importantly, be seen as in control of every situation. In stupider terms, Nightwing is a people pleaser and Firefly is a rage baiter. His design was very heavily inspired by Nausicaa Valley of the Wind for things like his colour palette and mask. I didn't do anything too crazy with their outfit, but I felt that just the fireproof suit on its own was a bit boring and didn't have a very interesting silhouette, so I gave him a big, granted unpractical jacket to flow over their shoulders like a cape. For their face design, I decided to have half their head be covered in a large burn scar, which I felt helped make the face stand out more and once again gave a more interesting silhouette, as now only half of their hair is able to grow. I also wanted to design both a more professional costume for him and a less protected one to showcase both his more controlled and more manic character traits in his costumes. This is the finished character sheet for Garfield Lynn / Firefly.
Never said that, and you're misquoting me, or somebody is, but I'm gonna get to the bottom of it. What's the point of sitting on the floor with your legs twisted into a pretzel talking to yourself for an hour and 45 minutes? It's weird. Well, anyway, it's not half as bad as double pneumonia, right? I mean, his dad's got 1 foot in the grave and 3 feet on a banana peel.
Lastly, we have a character that I've been quite excited about for a while, the Scarecrow. Now, most of my gripes with how the character of Scarecrow has been written have been covered many times before, most notably in a video by Pastra, which I recommend checking out, as it goes very in-depth on not only how Scarecrow hasn't really been portrayed well that often, but also on how he could be depicted well. I decided to take plenty of inspiration from this video while also adding a few new spins on the character. One thing that I tend to see neglected a lot of the time with people writing Scarecrow is his motivation. It's never really explained, at least all that well, why he does what he does. The most common motivation for him is that he was bullied growing up, so wants to get back at random Gotham citizens, I guess, but that not only makes zero sense logically, so makes him look like a petty dumbass, but also is just a lame fucking motivation for someone who's supposed to be the king of fear. I quite like the idea of something Pastra said in their video about Scarecrow possibly trying to overcome his own fears, so I wanted to take that and maybe expand upon it further. Maybe Scarecrow isn't just trying to overcome his own fears, but trying to help others overcome their own. Maybe he thinks he's helping people. Before I get into his backstory, I will just say that I did once again take a little bit of inspiration from Gotham. I know I talk about this show a lot, but I will defend it with my life. I mean, at least the first 3 seasons, I never got past the 3rd, but still. Also, in my defense, I actually took less inspiration from Jonathan himself in the show, and more so his dad, so do with that information what you will. Anyway, when Jonathan was young, he lived in the country with his parents and 2 siblings. They were a fairly normal family, but one day his father began to notice a strange substance growing on their walls that he assumed to be black mold, so decided to attempt to clean it while it was still located to one part of the house. That night, however, after being exposed to the mold, his father went insane, killing Jonathan's mother and hanging her body on the Scarecrow outside of their house. He would then go on to kill his 2 siblings and himself, leaving Jonathan as the only survivor. This event from his childhood would continue to plague him long into his adult life. Not only would all of his peers constantly discuss it, but he would continuously be plagued by nightmares and flashbacks in his day-to-day, making it incredibly difficult to move on. This would serve as his motivation to create the fear serum, not as a way to spread fear to other people, but as a form of intense exposure therapy. The mold in his childhood home would also play a large part in the creation of the fear drug, as it actually was very much not just black mold. It would actually turn out to be a new kind of mold with fear-inducing properties after prolonged exposure, and the reason his father went insane that night was actually due to said mold. For his design, I will admit I went a little bit crazy. There were just so many elements that I wanted to add to the costume, which I was worried would make it look cluttered, but honestly, I think it ended up working really well. I liked both the idea of giving him a mask made of burlap and a gas mask, so I did both, and I also drew some teeth on the gas mask later on to make it look like a monster's face cascaded in shadow. I gave him very long, matted hair, and I wanted his coat to mimic a straitjacket. I made the entire costume very stitchy, not only to mimic the whole Scarecrow theme, but to also represent the character's instability through his design. I couldn't really come up with a second version of his costume for the character sheet, so instead of a little chibi version at the bottom of the drawing, I drew his scythe. I made the scythe design fairly simple, but I did add a rope to the handle for the occasional little spinny move he might do. I like the close-up on the face, but I don't really like the other expressions I did, as I think I struggled to capture the features I gave him in the close-up drawing, so if I were to redraw anything, it would probably be that. I gave him a colour palette consisting of both mute browns and more Halloween-y colours like black and orange, tying it all together with a yellowish white for the coat. Here is the finished character sheet for Jonathan Crane / Scarecrow.
Actually, yes.
But only because you signed your notes. Every page, I might add. Yes, well, I wanted to talk about your work. Soon, there are people who need our help now.
Choice is false. It is how we clothe and forgive the baser instincts that spur us to division, death, war, prejudice.
And we're done with my first batch of scrimblos. There will be more to come. I would like to apologise for this video taking so long to get out. What with both the release of my new web series and album releasing in the same week, both of which you should go and check out now or else I will find you! I had a bit more than just this video on my plate. But do not worry, my disgusting little children. Daddy is back with the milk, Jesus Christ. There should be a few more of these videos to come, so hopefully I'll see you in the next one. How do you end a video again? Bye!